Good morning, church. Happy New Year tomorrow, New Year's Eve. Joey, our preaching minister, is out of town on a vacation with his wife today, so I have the honor of sharing this morning's message with y'all. And this morning as I was getting ready, my son walked in to where I was, and he said, "Daddy," he's 5, "you should talk about us this morning." And from a distance, I hear my wife go, "No!" So I'm glad I'm fulfilling my promise not to mention them in the service today. It's not happening. I was thinking during the last week or two about what message would be appropriate to share on New Year's Eve for people that are wrapping up one year and entering into the next. And for some reason, this phrase kept resonating in my mind, this idea of "this too shall pass." And it's not that I was thinking back on particular things that have happened in the last year that I'm really glad have passed, or things that I didn't want to pass that did anyway. It just seems like it fits with the transition from one thing to the next. You're thinking about the old, and you just have to acknowledge that, yeah, that has passed, and I'm entering into a new season right now. So as I was thinking about this phrase, and of course I needed to go and find out, what is the origin of the phrase "this too shall pass." So I was doing a little bit of research, and at one point Joey in the office walked up and he's like, "So what are you going to talk about?" And I said, "Well, there's this phrase, 'this too shall pass,' and do you want to know the origins of it?" And he was like, "I don't need to know. All I know is that whoever came up with that was probably eating chili at Crystal." And that seems like the appropriate thing that one would say when eating chili at Crystal. So he's probably right. But according to my research, that is not the origin of this phrase. There's actually some speculation as to where this originally came from. It's definitely ancient. It dates back a very, very long time ago. But the story that I thought was most interesting, and honestly most relevant to this, involves a magic ring that has this power to change people. And it doesn't look anything like that. That is the wrong magic ring. Okay, here's the magic ring I'm talking about. Hopefully that joke was funny to more than 4 of y'all in the audience. Little Lord of the Rings gag. But this is an example of the ring. It's obviously not the real ring, because the real ring is a fable. But the story that I like the most is actually from Jewish folklore. It's not from the Bible, but it is about King Solomon. So whether or not it's true doesn't really matter. It's just an interesting story. But it goes back a long time. The story essentially is this: that King Solomon, in all of his wisdom, decided that he needed to put one of his chief of staffs in their proper place. So apparently the chief of his army was a fairly arrogant fellow, and Solomon felt like he needed to bring him back down to size. So he told this man a story, and the story was that he had learned of a magical ring that had the power to dispel depression, but it also had the power to take someone who was happy and make them more sad. So basically it had the ability to alter the mood of a person, and he thought this would be a neat thing to have. So he tasked this guy, this chief of his army, to go and find this magical ring. And he said, "I'm going to give you 6 months to find it and bring it back to me. That's your task." So the guy goes out and he spends almost an entirety of 6 months looking for this magical ring, which Solomon knew wasn't real because he just made it up. And the guy, of course, can't find it. And finally, it's the final day. The deadline's coming. It's a few hours before. And according to the legend, he's back in Jerusalem and he's wandering around the city. He's looked in every ring shop. He can't find this magic ring. He's talked to everybody. But finally he realizes there's one person I haven't talked to yet. And it's this old silversmith that just lives there in the city. And so he goes to this guy and he says, "Hey man, I've been all over the place for 6 months and there's this magic ring apparently, and I can't find it. Have you ever heard of this before?" And according to the legend, the silversmith says, "I may have what it is you seek." And so he goes back in the back and he pulls out this old, just plain silver ring, and he begins to engrave on it. And he engraves these letters in Hebrew. And he hands it to the chief of the army, and the guy looks at it and he says, This is the ring. It's not the ring, but he's like, "No, this is what I need." So he takes it back to Solomon, who happens to be in the middle of a giant feast, and he's got all these people here, and it's elegant, it's a black tie affair, everything's nice and fancy. And of course, they're all, being entertained by the king. And so the chief of the army runs up and he says, "I found the ring that you're looking for." And he hands it to Solomon. Solomon looks down and reads it, and on it says in Hebrew, "This too shall pass." And according to legend, Solomon reads it and he looks out at all of the splendor of everything that he has done over the years, and he just begins to weep to himself because he realizes that this too will pass. And everybody stops and they're just staring at him thinking, what's wrong with the king? Why is he in tears? And Solomon pauses and he looks at the ring again and reads, "This too shall pass." And he starts laughing because he realizes that whether he's high or whether he's low, it's all going to pass at some point and move on to the next thing. And I like that story because how true is that? No matter what circumstance you're in at the moment, The truth is, it's going to pass. It might pass when, the next circumstance happens to you, or it might pass with your death, but it's going to end at some point, and that is just a true thing about our life circumstances. Now, I like the King Solomon story because it actually ties into the scripture that I wanted to use today. So King Solomon, of course, we know from our Bible history that he was known as the wisest man that had ever lived. He'd asked God for wisdom, he had received it, and that had been this blessing to him. He had been able to expand his kingdom to do incredible works of art and structures, and just the way that he had amassed wealth and knowledge were just unprecedented in the world up to that point. But at the end of his life, he's an old man now, and he's looking back at all the things that he has done, all the knowledge he's gained, all the wealth he's accumulated, and he's just thinking about it in the sense of, did this have a purpose? Did this have a point? And so, according to what most scholars think, is that he then wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, which you'll find in the Old Testament. And in this book of Ecclesiastes, he wrestles with this notion of, does anything have any meaning anyway? He almost asks that question literally over and over again. Is there any meaning in this? And he says over and over again, after describing certain things, he says, that's meaningless. This is meaningless. And in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, we get to this passage. And he's been trying to summarize everything that he's been learning. And he says, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Now, when you look back at your own experiences during this last year, can you look back at that, can you read that passage and think, I have experienced several of those things. I've experienced times of laughter and times of mourning, and maybe they even followed each other back to back. Have you experienced times that are positive, followed by times that are negative, or vice versa perhaps? You can probably look back on 2017 and say, yeah, I've been through that. That resonates with me because that is true of the experience that I've had. Even if most of your year was really great, you definitely, I guarantee it, had times that were lower than they were higher. So I think this is true, and I think he was really onto something here. But when you view everything as a whole, this whole section of time for this and time for that, I feel like these contrasting high and low statements remind us that whatever time it is right now for you, that time will pass. And there's some interesting implications of this idea. First of all, there's some good news. The low times don't last forever. I think we can all breathe a big sigh of relief with that revelation, right? Whatever low times you may be experiencing or have experienced, the truth is that those times will pass at some point. And I think we've all experienced this in different ways, but it's become very, very relevant to me just in the last few weeks because some of y'all didn't know, but one of our students in the youth group has recently been diagnosed with cancer, and she's having to battle through that right now. So she's in a low time in the scope of her life. We had another student that just got released from over a week of being hospitalized for another illness. So I know that between these two students, both of them would find great encouragement and would truly say that is good news to know that their low time will pass at some point. It's welcome news. It's the kind of things that we need to hear. But the trick with this is that sometimes it's easy to forget. And when we don't remember the truth that the low times don't last forever, we can find ourselves falling into a very dark place. And I'm not specifically referring to depression necessarily, although that can certainly be it. But if we forget that what we're going through right now isn't going to last forever and there will be something else on the other side, we can just get trapped in that. And it can churn in us, and it can cause us to damage or destroy relationships that we're in. It can cause us to damage or destroy ourselves. And it can just be a very, very bad place for us to be in if we forget that the low times don't last forever. So this is the good news. Low times don't last forever, but the bad news, of course, is that neither do the high times. And we all know this to be true. I'm not making up something that y'all have never heard before. But even though the low times do cease and we find ourselves experiencing high times again, we all know that those high times also are not going to last forever. Now, I may have told this story before. If I have, it's been a very long time since you heard it. And I think some of our youth have heard it. But this is my best example of high time not lasting. So when I was in actually freshman year of college, I came home during the summer after my freshman year to do my very, very first youth internship experience. And I'm one of the youth ministers here if you didn't know. So this was like my first go at practicing what I was ultimately going to get to do as my profession. So I was a junior high intern at my home church, and our church had been growing for several years. We had several youth interns. We had 2 youth ministers. There were a lot of really positive things that were happening. We were all collectively in a really good place. My dad was on staff there, had been for 26 years, so I was kind of, I was doing my ministry thing on the other side of the hall from where he was doing his ministry thing, and it was kind of like this cool little moment there. We were at the very, very end of our summer. We had 1 week left. We were in the midst of a giant building campaign where we were raising money to build this awesome new building in another part of town, just like the Hixson Clear Creek did several years ago. And we had just hired a new preacher just a few months before, and there was so much momentum and so much excitement, and things were looking really, really good, at least from my perspective. For me, this was a high time. And then the second to last Wednesday of the summer, I get a call from my mom. I was going to teach that night on joy, ironically. That was our subject for the night. My mom calls me and says, "Hey, are you coming home before church?" And I told her I wasn't planning on it. I was just going to stay. She was like, "You need to come home. We need to have a family meeting." And I was like, "Oh, man, what did I do?" That was my immediate assumption, of course, is that I had blown it somehow and they were going to confront me. That's not at all what it was. I get home, and it's me and my 2 younger siblings and mom and dad. My mom already knew this, of course. But my dad proceeded to tell us that day, our brand new preacher and also brand new administrative minister had come into his office, another one of our ministers, and a third minister on our staff, and told them that they have by Friday to clear out their office. They've been fired. And my dad, 26 years, one of the other guys, 19 years at this one church, and it was out of nowhere. A true bombshell. And it's a long story, which I won't get into, but it took me from high place to the exact opposite. And of course, it wasn't just about me. It was really more about my dad and my mom. But everything was great. It couldn't have gotten any better. And then, boom, one moment, and everything changed. And I was reminded that neither do the high times last. They too shall pass. But there is, I think, a valuable thing in remembering the bad news. And it's that it keeps us humble. One of our tendencies as human beings, I think, is to just think that everything is so great that it's probably somewhat because of our own actions or our own deeds. And look where I've gotten myself. So I think it's important to remember sometimes that the high times aren't going to last, and it keeps us humble in some sense. It reminds us that we got to look to something else besides just ourselves. And so as we're thinking about the low times and the high times and the time for this and the time for that, it's easy in my mind to ask the question, if that's all true, then where's the fun in all this? If nothing's going to last, if nothing stays the same, if you can never just rely on high times and feeling good, where's the fun in this life? And I feel like Solomon is trying to address that question in the book of Ecclesiastes. And he keeps going with this particular passage in verse 9. He says, "What does the worker gain from his struggles?" I think he's sort of asking the question, what is the point of all of this? And he literally asked the question, is anything meaningful, in several other places in the scripture. But he says, what does the worker gain from his struggles? I have seen the task that God has given people to keep them occupied. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts, but man cannot discover the work that God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for them, than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. It is also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts. I know that all that God does will last forever. There is no adding to it or taking away from it. God works so that people will be in awe of him. Whatever is has already been, and whatever will be already is. God repeats what has passed. It's kind of like he's saying, you just got to find contentment with what you can find contentment in. Because that's about the only thing that you can really rely on. But the problem with that is that he doesn't necessarily give you the true answer to contentment. He just kind of says, you got to find it. You got to figure out how to live the good life. Now, what I do think is a good thing that we're going to get to in a minute is I think we can find that ultimate anchor to find that true commitment in. But I was trying to I was trying to think about how to phrase some of this, and I was talking to my buddy Evan, who's one of our ministers on staff, and he was trying to help me kind of figure out how to word all this. And he said, Think about all the high times in your life and all the low times in your life. Is there a common denominator between those two? And he said, yes, there is. The common denominator is the fact that you are involved in them. So in your good times and your bad times, you're right in the middle of both of those. You're the common denominator, which is exactly why you can't necessarily rely on yourself to be the anchor that you find contentment in. Because you're there when it's bad and when it's good. And in a lot of cases, you are the reason that things shift from bad to good. So the hard news is that we have to find contentment, but in order to do so, you have to place your trust in something that is above and beyond yourself. Because you can't be relied upon as a source of commitment. So what is it that is above and beyond yourself that you can find? Now, the hard part about this is that it's really easy to make a statement like this, and it's very difficult to apply it to your life. I do not have the ultimate way to do this. I just know that this is true. And I think most of you would probably say the same thing, that doing is harder than saying it. But I do believe that the Bible provides us some answers for this. And I also believe, and I think this is critical to understanding the above and beyond, that each person on this planet is part of a much bigger story than just the one that they're involved in. There's this concept in biblical interpretation known as the higher and lower story. And the simple idea is that the lower stories are all of the little mini narratives that we see throughout the Bible. It's the story of Joseph, the story of David, the story of Paul, whatever. And all of those are sort of self-contained stories. And within each of those, you have highs and lows, and things can get pretty messy, but sometimes they can resolve. But there's this idea of a higher story, which is the overarching scope of what God is doing throughout all of creation. So God takes all of these lower stories and he kind of plugs them in to this bigger story. And I think that's true for us. Rather than you and me being our own higher story, we are just lower parts of this bigger story that is above and beyond ourselves. So, I have to confess something to all of you. I'm not in high school anymore, but there are some things that I still remember that have stuck with me from high school even to this day. And one of those is this really nerdy love of physics. Yes, I know. And so much so that every now and then I just feel like it would be fun to read a book about physics. And so I do. And I just finished reading one. It's not because I have to take a test on it tomorrow. It's because I just thought it would be fun and interesting. And most of y'all are probably rolling your eyes right now. But for me, that's something that I find enjoyable. So I've been reading this book about physics. And one thing that I picked up on is that when physicists are trying to explain the universe or trying to explain something regarding space or whatever, they usually try to do so through formulas and equations. That's just a mathematical way for them to express these truths. And I thought, let's try to apply that same principle to what we're doing here today. So I made an equation. All right, stick with me here. In this equation, y plus x equals c. And in this equation, y equals your understanding of yourself. Who are you? Where is your place in this universe? X is the anchor that you can put your trust in, that when added to your understanding of yourself, equals some level of contentment. Now, just like this, you can plug in a whole bunch of different things into this equation, and what you're going to get is a different answer every time. So depending on how you view yourself, and depending on what your anchor is going to give you a different contentment level if you change those things around. So I want to propose that rather than there being just like an infinite number of ways of doing this, which there are, I want to argue that there's actually a true way to solve this, where you're seeking a true contentment, but to get that, you have to have a true sense of self, and you have to have a true anchor. Add those together, and you find true contentment. Okay, I'm not just making all this up. I feel like there are answers to this in Scripture. So let's solve for y for a minute. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Let's solve for y. I think the Bible provides a lot of different ways that we can look at this. But here's an example. From Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, Jesus is telling this parable, and here's basically how it goes. He's talking to all these different religious leaders, and he says, there's a story about these two guys. One of them is a Pharisee, who is, of course, to them known as the righteous person, who kind of understood the law and understood how things were supposed to work spiritually. And the other guy was a tax collector, which was essentially a euphemism for a sinner. Like the lowest person. So you got the higher righteous person, and you got the lower, down the dirt sinner. And they both are coming before God, and one of them is approaching God saying, look at all that I have done. Look at my prayers, and look at my evangelism, and look at my giving. And he's trying to say, I have almost achieved righteousness through my deeds. And Jesus is contrasting that with the tax collector, which in the story comes before God on his knees, just crying out to God, saying, have mercy on me, Lord, for I am a sinner. And Jesus' message is, which of these two is the right approach for you to take in your life? Is it self-righteousness that you have accomplished this holiness? Or is it to crawl before God and say, have mercy on me, for I am a sinner? And I think the idea here is that a true sense of self is more like what the way that the tax collector views himself. It's this idea that a humble acceptance that you are a most treasured possession of God, even though you are a sinner in need of grace. In my opinion, that's one of the simplest ways to understand yourself, is you are a treasured possession of God, despite the fact that you are a sinner in need of grace. That's a humbling thing, but also a comforting thing, I think. So what about X? Right? What is the true anchor that will help us find true contentment? I was looking at a lot of different things, and there's literally hundreds of scriptures that I could find. But as I was working on this lesson, there was a particular song that kept coming up in my mind, and I ended up listening to it several different times. And I wanted to share, almost in poetry form, some of the lyrics to this song. It's a song called "One Thing Remains," originally written by the Bethel Music Group. But here's some of the lyrics to that song, and see if this helps pinpoint where your true anchor might need to be. So here's some of the words. Higher than the mountains that I face, stronger than the power of the grave, constant through the trial and the change, one thing remains. Your love never fails and never gives up. It never runs out on me. Because on and on and on and on it goes before it overwhelms and satisfies my soul, and I never ever have to be afraid. One thing remains. In death and in life, I'm confident and covered by the power of your great love. My debt is paid. There's nothing that can separate my heart from your great love. Your love never fails and never gives up. It never runs out on me. Wouldn't that be a great thing to place our anchor in? The never failing, never giving up, never running out love of God. That is something that we can place our trust and our anchor in, because all of these nevers that are part of it. This is one thing that is everlasting, and it is manifested in Jesus Christ. Now here's where this equation gets really nerdy. So the word Christ in Greek is Christo, which starts with the letter X, essentially. So I thought it was just kind of cool how, if you want to talk about the true anchor, Christ represented by an X is the X in our equation. So going back to this for a moment here, the true understanding of yourself, which is this idea that you're a treasured possession of God, despite the fact that you're a sinner in need of grace, if you add to that this knowledge of this never-ending love of God that is shown in Jesus, add those two things together, and you can find true contentment in this life despite the passing from highs to lows and from this time to that time. Now, Paul has an interesting take on this that I'm gonna use to end with. And in this particular part of the Bible, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul is writing to this church in Corinth, and he's trying to encourage them and provide them with spiritual support and to show them, here's a better way to live now that you've given yourselves to Christ. This, of course, is not the first letter he's written to them. So he's trying to keep this dialogue going and address different things that are happening in their lives. And in this particular passage in chapter 4, he's alluding to several things that have happened to him in his life, and several of his disciple friends also, that have helped him to narrow down this anchor source that has led him to finding true commitment in life. And before the passage that we're about to read, earlier in chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, he's been talking about this idea of there being a ministry that a Christian receives, and that ministry is based on this knowledge of the truth of God. Basically, he's saying we have been given this gospel, which literally does mean good news in the original language. We have been given this knowledge of God in Jesus, and it is good news for all of us. And that is something that we should treasure. This knowledge of God, this gospel message, is a treasure to us. And he goes on to say, this treasure, which we have in clay jars. Clay jars, if you've never heard this before, he's just referencing the relative fragility of a human being. On the grand scheme of things, what are we anyway? We're just dust. We're just the substance that makes up clay. There's not much to us. We're fragile. We're easily crushed. But we have a treasure inside of us so that the extraordinary power that we show may be from God and not from us. He says he's really saying, I know this, I have lived it. He says we are pressured in every way but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. I can read those statements, and for me, they're really just kind of words. I mean, I have experienced pressure, sure, and I've been confused about life, and maybe a little bit of persecution, but to him, these were things that have actually happened. He was crushed by stones on a couple of occasions. He was left for dead. He was flogged brutally. He was imprisoned. He was practically drowned. I mean, all these things actually happened to him. So when he's writing to these guys, and they know these things, they're saying, wow, Paul's actually been through these experiences, and yet he can say that he was able to come through it because of the treasure that he has, because of this contentment that he's found in this particular anchor. And he goes on and he says, we always carry the death of Jesus in our body, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who live are always being given over to death because of Jesus, so that Jesus' life may also be revealed in our mortal flesh. He's basically saying that as we experience all of these terrible things in this life, these low times, what's happening is that God is able to reveal himself through those times. And then he says, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. He was willing to endure the low down, dark times because he knew that God was revealing himself through Paul as an example and an inspiration for everybody else. So even while Paul was experiencing death on a regular basis, everyone who can look at his life can receive life from his example. And that is pretty cool, because here's what Paul understood. Paul understood that everything that happens to a person in this life is passing, but hoping and trusting in the resurrection power of Jesus leads to life everlasting. And that is something that we can truly find contentment in.